Our fortune, a murder, and a secret no one dares to claim. Welcome to Word Script Den. I am your host, Nero. This mystery-loving community amazes me. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your voices make these stories come alive. Let's begin. If there's one ironclad rule in the Wolfe household, it's that no one with a problem worth more than pocket change is supposed to show up before Nero Wolfe has communed with his orchids. That sacred ritual runs from 9 to 11 every morning, and it takes an act of God, or occasionally Inspector Kramer with homicide steaming out of his ears, to breach it. On that Thursday in October, the act of God arrived in the shape of a young woman who managed to bypass both the front bell and Fritz's moral code about uninvited callers. She was in the office when I came down the stairs, standing by Wolfe's globe, fingering it as though deciding which continent to take over first. Now, I don't usually get floored by entrances. I've seen enough hopeful clients, crackpots, and tearful nieces to recognize the patterns. But this one carried herself with an air that didn't fit the usual script. She was maybe 28, dressed in a suit that cost more than my monthly expense account, with a face that would have gotten her a free meal at any restaurant in Manhattan if she smiled. Which, at that moment, she wasn't. Instead, she looked at me with something close to relief. "Mr. Goodwin? That's the name they gave me at birth," I said. Though usually it takes a telephone appointment and an ounce of luck to end up in this office before Wolfe's daily flora worship. "How did you manage it?" "I paid the delivery man," she confessed, lowering her voice. "The one who brings groceries. He said he could get me in. He knocked, the cook let him, and here I am." I gave her a long look. She didn't blush. That alone put her above half the heiresses in this town. "Well, Miss Langdon. Harriet Langdon." The name clicked faintly, though not with any recent scandal. "Maybe finance? Maybe society pages. And what urgent catastrophe, Miss Langdon, made bribery the only path to our humble chairs?" "I need Nero Wolfe," she said simply. "And if he won't see me before orchids, then I'm afraid someone is going to die before dinner." That line was good enough to stop me from throwing her out. But it wasn't good enough to make Wolfe interrupt the orchids. Still, I filed it away. Because when a woman in pearls drops a bomb like that before coffee, you don't just sweep it under the rug. I gestured her toward the red leather chair and phoned the plant rooms. Wolfe answered in his usual irritated growl. "Yes? A Miss Harriet Langdon is here. She bribed her way in. Says death is imminent. You want me to toss her or keep her breathing till you descend?" There was a pause, the kind that means Wolfe is calculating whether orchids outrank homicide. His eventual reply was dry as vermouth. "Keep her breathing. I'll finish early." Which was Wolfe speak for. This woman had just rattled the foundations of the brownstone. "Would you like me to continue directly into Section 2, the brownstone disturbed, where Wolfe meets Harriet Langdon and she explains the trouble? Or would you prefer me to expand this opening scene further, with Archie's observations and small talk, before Wolfe arrives?" I gave Miss Harriet Langdon the courtesy of not grilling her until Wolfe came down. That wasn't out of gallantry, it was tactical. Wolfe would want the first telling untainted by my interruptions, and I had learned early that nothing in the world annoyed him more than hearing a client's story second-hand when he could have had it first-hand. So I parked myself in my chair, crossed one leg over the other, and kept her occupied with the kind of questions that don't count. She had the poise of someone used to being watched, which meant she either grew up with money or was good at faking it. Since her handbag alone probably paid a stenographer's yearly salary, I leaned toward the former. We didn't have long to wait. 10 minutes later, the thump of Wolfe's shoes on the stairs came like a sermon bell. He entered the office as though the orchids had dismissed him, rather than the other way around. He was in a yellow shirt and brown suspenders, his bulk carefully arranged into dignity. His eyes flicked to her once, then to me, then back to her. That was the only acknowledgement she got. "You bribed my delivery man," he said, settling himself behind his desk. His tone carried the chill of an icicle. "I did," she admitted, her chin rising half an inch. "I was desperate. You presume," Wolfe went on, "that my orchids may be neglected, my cook inconvenienced, and my peace disturbed because you are desperate. Explain." She didn't wilt. That caught his interest, though he didn't show it. He gave her the faintest nod, the sort you'd miss if you blinked. "My father, Charles Langdon, died 2 months ago," she began. Her voice was steady, rehearsed even, but her hand kept tracing the rim of her handbag. His estate is enormous and the will was unusual. He divided most of it into 4 equal shares. Myself, my cousin Gerald, my cousin's wife Evelyn, and, oddly, his attorney of 30 years, Walter Fisk. I whistled softly. A lawyer who doesn't just draft the will but cashes in on it. That's colourful. Her eyes darted to me, but she pressed on. The condition was that the estate would not be disbursed until 6 months had passed, during which the 4 of us must remain alive and intact. Wolfe's brows rose the slightest degree. Intact? Yes, that was his word. My father believed money destroys families. He said if any of us were killed, incapacitated, or found guilty of attempting to remove another, the guilty party would forfeit their share to the remaining beneficiaries. It was meant to keep us honest. Pah! Wolfe's lips curled. A grotesque contrivance. It presumes avarice will not outweigh caution. Your father was a fool, she didn't flinch. Maybe he was. But yesterday someone broke into my apartment. They left nothing stolen, except for one thing. A letter my father had written me before he died. It wasn't valuable in money terms, but in it, he hinted that he distrusted one of the others. Now it's gone. And this morning I found a note slipped under my door. It said, "You're next." That stopped even Wolfe from reaching for his beer, which Fritz had just deposited. His eyes closed briefly, the way they do when he's rearranging facts in his head like chessmen. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Why have you come here? You have police." "Because," she said, and this time her voice cracked just slightly, "the police will investigate a crime only after it happens. And if I'm correct, by then it will be too late." There was silence. Wolfe tapped a finger on the arm of his chair, slowly, like a man measuring time. I knew the signs. He was interested, though he hated admitting it. He'd heard a puzzle, and puzzles were bait he never could resist. Never could. He opened his eyes and gave her the stare that had flattened more than one crook and client alike. "You have not yet told me what you expect of me." "I expect you to keep me alive," she said flatly. That got a twitch out of me. Wolfe's jowls tightened, and for a second I thought he'd order her out. Wolfe doesn't keep people alive. He solves problems, exposes liars, and sends criminals into Kramer's lap. Bodyguarding isn't in his repertoire. He surprised me. "No," he said, "I will not keep you alive. That is your responsibility, but I may discover who intends you dead." Her shoulders dropped in relief. She hadn't even noticed the trap in his words. Wolfe wasn't promising safety. He was promising an intellectual hunt. "I'll take it," she said quickly. "Whatever your fee," that was my cue. I pulled out the notebook, ready for the drill. Wolfe's fees are his own mystery, sometimes a king's ransom, sometimes peanuts, depending on what tickled him. But instead of dictating, he sat back and regarded her as though she were a particularly overgrown orchid with an unknown disease. "Tell me," he said, "of your cousin Gerald. What manner of man is he?" And so it began. Harriet Langdon painted portraits with words. Gerald the gambler, charming but perpetually in debt. Evelyn his wife, sharper than she looked, who had married Gerald for status but wanted money of her own. Walter Fisk, the lawyer, cold and disciplined, who had never married and had been almost like a brother to her father. Each one had motive dripping from their sleeves like grease on Fritz's roast pan. I jotted notes, but I was watching her too. People leak more with their eyes than their mouths, and she was no exception. When she mentioned Gerald, there was a flicker of pity. Evelyn earned a spark of dislike. But Fisk, when she said his name, her lips tightened as though she'd bitten into something sour. Wolfe noticed too. "You distrust Mr. Fisk?" "Yes," she swallowed. "I think he orchestrated the break-in. He knows the law, he knows the stakes, and he frightened my father near the end." "Frightened him?" Wolfe pressed. "My father hinted at it. That Fisk knew too much. That he was indispensable but dangerous." Wolfe grunted. "Very well. Mr. Goodwin will begin with Mr. Fisk. I wish to see the man's eyes. He will not, of course, show them to me in person, since I do not stir. But Archie will suffice. That was my marching order, neatly packaged. I was to play scout while Wolfe sat tight, weaving the web. Harriet Langdon looked from Wolfe to me, a question trembling on her lips. But Wolfe forestalled her. "You may go," he said firmly. "Mr. Goodwin will contact you for particulars. My cook will escort you out." It was abrupt, but it worked. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and gave me a look that said she wasn't used to being dismissed like a stenographer. I offered her an arm, but she ignored it, and I trailed her to the door. When I came back, Wolfe had already poured beer. His eyes were closed again, lids heavy, as though Harriet Langdon's visit had been nothing more than a mild annoyance. But I knew better. The brownstone had been disturbed, and Nero Wolfe had taken the bait. The trap was set, and I was the one who'd be walking straight into it, word County 2540. Would you like me to move straight into Archie's legwork with Walter Fisk, the lawyer, or first expand on the in-brownstone tension, Wolfe's silent musings, Fritz's comments, maybe even a call from Kramer sniffing around, to thicken the atmosphere before Archie hits the street? When Harriet Langdon's heels clicked out across the hallway tile and the front door closed behind her, the brownstone exhaled its usual hush. Fritz padded back to his kitchen with a dignity that suggested he disapproved of women who bribed delivery boys, and I leaned back in my chair waiting for Wolfe to speak. He didn't. He poured the rest of his beer, tilted the glass and regarded the foam as though it might rearrange itself into an answer. I've been with Wolfe long enough to know when silence means dismissal. But this wasn't that brand of silence. This was the simmering kind, the kind that told me the cogs were already turning under that thick forehead of his. "You're sending me to Fisk first," I said finally. Breaking the still air, yes, his voice was deep, almost drowsy. The lawyer is the fulcrum. Inheritance, ambition, threats. He mediates all three. If there is treachery, he will know whether or not he is the author. Fine, I'll pay him a visit. You want the usual manner, temperament, possible guilty twitches? Yes, and precision. He closed his eyes again. The girl is frightened. That may be genuine, but fear often distorts. I require fact, that was all I'd get. When Wolfe retreats into monosyllables, it means his mind is chewing on something, and words are wasted calories. I pocketed my notebook and went upstairs to swap my in-brownstone jacket for one better suited to fieldwork. If Walter Fisk was the sort of lawyer who'd finagled himself into a will, I wanted to look respectable enough to get in the door, but casual enough to let him underestimate me. The October air slapped me awake as I stepped outside. New York has a way of making you believe everybody on the sidewalk is heading for a more important appointment than you are. I threaded my way through them and hailed a cab. The address Harriet had given me was on East 67th, an office building that liked to pretend it had class by polishing its brass handles daily. Walter Fisk's office was on the 4th floor, behind a door with his name etched in small, neat letters. No flourish, no escort, just Walter Fisk, lawyers, who dispense with the trimmings. Are either supremely competent or supremely dangerous, a receptionist who had seen too many people and cared, for none of them looked up from her typewriter. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, giving her my most genial grin. "But I've got something better, persistence. Tell Mr. Fisk that Archie Goodwin wants 10 minutes. He'll want to hear what I have to say." She sniffed, unimpressed, but picked up the phone and murmured into it. After a moment, she waved me toward the inner office with the resigned air of someone watching a fool march to his own demise. Walter Fisk was lean, 50-ish, with steel-gray hair and a suit that looked pressed even at the cuffs. His office was neat enough to make a hospital ward feel slovenly. He rose when I entered, extending a dry, cool hand that felt like parchment. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. His voice was low, precise. "You represent Nero Wolfe." I took the chair he indicated and gave him the smile I usually reserve for suspects who think they're smarter than me. "I work for Wolfe. Representing him is another matter entirely. You know Miss Langdon, of course." His eyes flickered, the barest movement. "Naturally. She's worried. Somebody broke into her place, lifted a letter, and left a note. She thinks the inheritance game her father designed is turning into a death match." Fisk's lips compressed. "Miss Langdon has always been imaginative." "Maybe, but imagination doesn't jimmy locks. You wouldn't know anything about that." The steel in his gaze hardened. "I am an attorney, Mr. Goodwin. I have no need to prowl apartments." "Sure, but you do have need of her share. If one of the others happens to, shall we say, meet with misfortune, that was bait, and he didn't rise." He leaned back, folding his long fingers together like ivory tongs. "Mr. Langdon included me in his will because I earned his trust across 3 decades. If his daughter doubts that, it is unfortunate, but irrelevant. I have no motive to harm her. In fact, any such act would cast immediate suspicion upon me. Hardly desirable." He had a point, but people often think logic protects them when greed is stronger. I decided to push. So you deny scaring old man Langdon near the end? She says he thought you dangerous. That did it. For just a second his eyes sparked. Not anger exactly, but a flash of something personal. Then the shutters closed. Glint in his eyes, as if the idea of someone acting on threats amused him. I logged it in memory. I stood. Thanks for the chat. If you think of any reason someone might want Harriet nervous enough to hire us, send me a postcard. He didn't rise, didn't offer a handshake, just inclined his head with mechanical courtesy. Back on the sidewalk, I drew a lungful of city air to scrub away the scent of that office. Walter Fisk had the calm of a man who trusted his own cleverness more than the law, which meant he was either clean or he thought himself untouchable. Neither option made me happy. I swung by a payphone to check in. Wolfe hated phone calls interrupting his routines, but he tolerated mine if they carried fact. He picked up on the second ring. Yes? Fisk plays it smooth, I reported. Neat office, neat lies. He claims Harriet's imaginative, denies the break-in and says any suspicion would naturally fall on him, so he wouldn't risk it. But he flinched when I mentioned her father thinking him dangerous. There was a pause. He will bear watching, Wolfe murmured. And Gerald Langdon? I can try him next. He's supposed to be at some club downtown. You want me to sniff him out tonight? Yes, but with care. Gamblers are volatile, and if he is desperate, he may act rashly. To observe, do not provoke. That's my middle name, I said, though he knew better. When I hung up, dusk had already slipped between the buildings. New York takes on a particular edge after dark, where even doormen look like they're hiding secrets. I headed south toward Gerald Langdon's haunt, a club called the Azure, which specialized in overpriced whiskey and underpriced illusions of grandeur. Inside, blue lights glowed against mirrored walls, and a pianist coaxed melancholy out of ivory keys. Gerald Langdon was easy to spot, a man in his mid-30s with charm leaking out of every gesture. His jacket was too loud, his tie too bright, and the laugh he aimed at the waitress was the kind that asked for credit. I watched him from the bar, nursing a ginger ale. If Walter Fisk had been a study in restraint, Gerald was the opposite. Restless energy, tapping fingers, eyes darting to the door every time someone walked in. A man measuring opportunities against disasters. When the waitress passed, I slid her a bill and asked her to introduce me. Gerald welcomed me like a long-lost backer, clapping my shoulder and ordering another round on my tab, naturally. We talked cards, horses, and the general untrustworthiness of mankind. Then I steered him gently toward Harriet. My cousin Harriet, he said with a smirk. Pretty little thing, but soft. She thinks the world is going to crumble because someone rattled her locks. I told her she should get a watchdog. Instead, she runs to a detective. Typical. Detectives sometimes help, I said lightly. He shrugged. Maybe, but Harriet's the kind who sees shadows in daylight. Me, I just play the hand dealt. And if the will's a trap, well, then we're all in it together. Unless somebody decides to cheat. His laugh was too quick, too forced. And behind it, I caught the gleam of something not so funny. Gerald Langdon was worried. Badly. I left him mid-sip, claiming another appointment, and stepped out into the cool night. I had a lawyer with sharp edges and a gambler on the edge, both with reasons to want more than their share. Harriet hadn't exaggerated. The game was in motion. As I hailed a cab back to the brownstone, I couldn't shake the thought that Wolfe had already calculated 3 moves ahead of me, and that somewhere in the city, another player was about to show their hand. Word count the 560. Would you like me to follow Archie straight back into the brownstone for Wolfe's reaction? Or should we linger with Archie's nighttime legwork, perhaps Evelyn Langdon's turn under the microscope, before Wolfe begins to weave it all tighter? By the time I reached the brownstone, Fritz had the aroma of veal cutlets drifting out from the kitchen, and the house had settled into its usual evening rhythm. I let myself in, hung up my hat and went straight to the office. Wolfe was in his chair, his bulk comfortably spread, the high-backed throne tilted back at an angle that suggested he'd been in the same position since I'd phoned him. A glass of beer sat half-drained beside him, and his eyes flicked toward me just long enough to mark my arrival before returning to whatever corner of the ceiling he was dissecting. I gave him the report while it was fresh. He didn't interrupt. He never does until I've laid the whole thing out, and then only if I've left a hole wide enough to drive a brewery wagon through. When I finished describing Gerald's jittery cheer at the Azure, Wolfe let the silence hang for several seconds, then exhaled through his nose. Pfui. A gambler with debts, a lawyer with ice in his veins, a dead man's daughter trembling at shadows, and money, always money, dangling like meat over a kennel of dogs. He shifted in his chair, an effort in itself. They will not wait 6 months in peace. That contrivance will breed venom. No argument there, I said, taking my seat across from him. Harriet's father wanted to keep them honest, but all he did was give them a reason to plot. Fisk's got the brains, Gerald's got the desperation. You want me to make Evelyn next on the dance card? Wolfe's lids lowered. Yes, the wife of Gerald is key. Women in such arrangements often see farther than their husbands. She will be ambitious, and ambition requires opportunity. Ascertain whether she has it. Fine, but it's late. You want me to drop by uninvited and hope she's still dressed for company? Wolfe closed his eyes, which meant the conversation was ending. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. Early enough to catch her unguarded, that was that. Fritz called me to dinner, and I let Wolfe eat in his customary silence, though my own appetite wasn't so serene. If Harriet was right, somebody was already maneuvering. And maneuvering tends to turn into something nastier when the stakes are high enough. The next morning I was up and dressed while Wolfe was still with his orchids. I skipped breakfast. Evelyn Langdon didn't strike me as the kind who welcomed surprise visits after 10, and headed uptown. Harriet had given me her cousin's address, a glossy apartment on Park Avenue, where even the doormen wore expressions that said they could buy and sell you twice before lunch. Mrs. Evelyn Langdon opened the door herself, which was surprise number 1. She was tall, dark-haired, with cheekbones sharp enough to slice cheese, and an expression that asked at once what I wanted and why I dared to interrupt her morning. She was dressed too carefully for a casual breakfast at home, which meant she was either expecting someone or she wanted to look formidable for anyone who came calling. Yes, she said, cool as a marble statue. Archie Goodwin, I told her. I'm with Nero Wolfe. I'd like a few minutes. Her eyes narrowed. Nero Wolfe. Harriet again, isn't it? I should have known. Miss Langdon did suggest you might be worth talking to, I admitted. But if you'd rather I come back with a badge and a warrant, I can always ask Inspector Kramer to do the honors. That softened her just enough. She stepped aside and let me in. The living room was chic, every piece of furniture calculated to impress. She motioned me to a low chair and took the sofa, perching on its edge like a woman prepared for combat. I assume Harriet has told you her tragic story, Evelyn said. The note, the break-in, the lurking menace. Do you believe her? I believe someone broke into her apartment, I said. I believe they took a letter. And I believe she's rattled enough to hire Wolfe, that's fact. Whether the menace is real or not, that's what I'm here to find out. Evelyn's lips curved. Not a smile, but the ghost of one. And you think I had something to do with it? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Men like you circle a subject until the prey walks into the center. She leaned back, crossing her legs. Very well. I have no need of threats. Gerald and I will have our share in due time. I have no patience for melodrama. Your husband didn't seem so patient last night, I said. He was laughing too hard for a man with steady nerves. Her eyes flashed. Gerald is weak. He plays at being a man of the world, but he is frightened of his own shadow. If anyone is likely to ruin our future, it is him, not me. Do you understand? I did. I also understood that she despised her husband, just enough to throw him under a bus if it meant clearing her own path. But that didn't make her innocent. What about Fisk? I asked. You trust him? Evelyn's mouth tightened. Walter is efficient. Ruthless, perhaps, but my uncle trusted him more than his own blood. He is not sentimental, and he has no love for Harriet. If he wanted to remove obstacles... She trailed off and gave a shrug elegant enough for a Paris runway. That was all she'd give me, at least without pressing hard enough to break the furniture. I filed it away and rose. Thanks for the morning chat. If anything exciting happens between now and 6 months from now, call Wolfe. You've got the number. She didn't see me out. Back on the street, I stopped at a diner for coffee and notes. Evelyn Langdon had ambition wrapped around her like a fur stole, and she wasn't shy about implying her husband was expendable. Between her and Fisk, Harriet had enemies enough without a mysterious break-in. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk with a stack of bills he pretended to ignore. He listened as I gave him Evelyn's lines, then grunted. Predictable, he said. She confirms what we knew. Gerald is a liability, Fisk is a menace, and she herself is dangerous. Did she admit to malice? Not in so many words. But she as much as told me Gerald's weakness could sink them both. She didn't look like a woman planning to sink with him. Wolfe tapped his fingertips together, closing his eyes. We have 3, each capable, each willing, each with motive. Now we wait. Wait, I asked. You want me to sit here while someone else breaks locks and leaves notes? Yes, wait, they will act again, they must. And when they do, they will betray themselves. It wasn't much of a strategy if you were Harriet Langdon waiting for the next threat to arrive on her doormat, but Wolfe's patience had the weight of granite. I knew better than to argue. I was about to head upstairs when the phone rang. I caught it. A crisp female voice came through, shaking only slightly. Mr. Goodwin? This is Harriet. Guys, someone's been in my apartment again. This time they didn't take anything. They left something. What? A knife, she whispered. On my pillow. I glanced at Wolfe. His eyes were open, steady, waiting. Stay put, I told her. Lock the door. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Wolfe's voice, deep and deliberate, rolled across the room. Bring the knife here, Archie, untouched. It will tell us more than any of them will confess, and just like that, the game moved from shadows into daylight. Word count, a 1560. Do you want me to have Archie go straight to Harriet's apartment to retrieve the knife and describe the scene in detail? Or bring it back quickly, so Wolfe can start his analysis and verbal maneuvering inside the brownstone? I was out the door in less than a minute, coat half-buttoned and hat jammed on. Wolfe's instructions about handling the knife like a relic from Tutankhamun's tomb were still ringing in my ears, but I didn't need the reminder. Whoever had slipped into Harriet's apartment twice wasn't playing for drama anymore. A knife on a pillow is less subtle than a Broadway marquee. The cab dropped me on East 71st, and I took the stairs to Harriet's building 2 at a time. When she cracked the door, I saw enough in her face to know she hadn't slept much since our meeting. Her eyes were rimmed red, her hair tied back in a way that said she hadn't looked in a mirror. She stepped aside without a word, and I walked in. The place was neat but tense like its owner. She led me straight to the bedroom, where the morning light slanted across a pale coverlet. And there it was. A knife, kitchen variety, 8 inches, laid squarely on the pillow as if someone had placed it with care. It gleamed faintly, wiped clean. Don't touch it, I said automatically, though she hadn't moved closer. I slipped the handkerchief from my pocket and lifted it by the handle, keeping the blade away from my clothes. No fingerprints, no smears. Whoever left it wasn't careless. That meant it wasn't a threat from impulse. It was calculated, rehearsed, and meant to hit like a hammer. Harriet stood stiff, arms crossed over her chest. I didn't hear anything. Nothing was forced. My lock was intact. I woke up, went to make coffee, and when I came back, there it was. You were in the apartment the whole time? Yes, her voice cracked. I thought I was going insane. That someone had left it before I woke up. But no, I know I checked the bed. I made it myself this morning. That narrowed the timeline. Either she had a visitor while she stepped out for her coffee, or someone had found a way inside earlier and waited. Neither option was reassuring. Look, Harriet, I said, keeping my tone light because she didn't need blunt honesty just then. Whoever left this wanted you rattled, not dead. If they'd wanted dead, they wouldn't have gone shopping in your kitchen drawers. That doesn't make me feel safer, Mr. Goodwin. Didn't think it would, I admitted. I folded the knife in my handkerchief, careful as if it were nitroglycerin, and tucked it under my arm. I'll take this to Wolfe. He'll decide what to make of it. Meanwhile, you double-check your locks and keep the chain on. If anyone else gets in, you phone me immediately. She nodded, but her lips were set in a thin line. Do you really think he can stop this? If anyone can, I told her, it's Wolfe. He doesn't move much. But his brain covers more ground than the subway system. That earned me the faintest smile, and I left before she could think herself back into fear. The ride back to the brownstone felt longer, the knife burning a hole in the crook of my arm. Fritz opened the door with eyebrows raised, and I headed straight to the office where Wolfe was waiting. He hadn't shifted position since I'd left. Only the beer glass had been refilled. I set the knife down on his blotter, handkerchief still wrapped. He opened his eyes, studied it, and gave the faintest grunt. Crude. Crude enough to scare her plenty, I said, taking my chair. She swears the bed was clear when she went to the kitchen, No forced entry, no broken lock. Somebody got in quiet, planted that, and left without her hearing a thing. That is the point, Wolfe said. It was not to kill. It was to be discovered. I leaned back. So you think it's theatre? Of course. He picked up the handkerchief by its corners, eyeing the knife with a distaste he usually reserves for cheap beer. Had they intended violence, they would not have left it sheathed in cotton on her pillow. They wished her to be unsettled. That suggests impatience. Someone fears delay, and delay is inevitable with that absurd will. I thought of Gerald's tapping fingers, Evelyn's poised disdain, Fisk's glint of amusement. Impatience fit any of them. So I said, what next? More waiting. Wolfe's eyes closed again. Not entirely. Mr. Panzer must be summoned. That got my eyebrows up. Wolfe didn't call in Saul unless he wanted shadows followed, without the target ever knowing they'd been tailed. Who's on the watch list? All three. Gerald, Evelyn, and Fisk. Saul will divide his time. I wish to know who moves when they believe themselves unseen. I nodded. Saul Panzer was a one-man surveillance team who could tail a man through Times Square on New Year's Eve and never be noticed. If one of the Langdon Circle made a slip, Saul would catch it. I'll give him the details, I said. Meanwhile, Harriet's shaking hard. She'll need reassurance. She will endure, Wolfe muttered, dismissing her distress like a crumb brushed off the tablecloth. Fear is her ally. It will keep her cautious. It will keep her cautious. I didn't argue, but I wasn't thrilled with the plan of leaving a frightened woman to stew in her apartment while knives made house calls. Still, Wolfe's method wasn't built for comfort. It was built for results. I phoned Saul, gave him the addresses, the names, and enough context to whet his appetite. He didn't ask questions. He never does. He just said, I'll start tonight, and hung up. The day crawled on. Wolfe spent the afternoon with his orchids, and I ran errands that weren't important but kept me moving. By the time evening settled in, the brownstone was heavy with silence. Wolfe returned downstairs for dinner. Fritz served duck with orange glaze, and we ate in near quiet until the phone rang. I picked it up. Saul's voice was calm, clipped, but there was a spark beneath it. Gerald Langdon, he said. He met with someone an hour ago. Not in his usual club. A bar in the village. The man was Fisk. That snapped my eyes wide. The lawyer and the gambler. How chummy. They spoke privately for 20 minutes. Gerald was agitated. Fisk left composed. Gerald stayed another hour drinking. Then he staggered out. Wolfe's gaze was on me, unreadable. I relayed the words, and he made a low sound. So they meet in secret. Looks like it, I said. Gerald desperate, Fisk calm. If they're cooking something together, Harriet's knife pillow trick might have been part of it. Or not, Wolfe murmured. For it may have been staged to distract her, while the true maneuver was elsewhere. That was Wolfe all over, never satisfied with the surface explanation. For him, a knife on a pillow wasn't evidence of menace. It was camouflage for the real game. Saul had more. Evelyn stayed home. No visitors. She read on the balcony for 2 hours. No sign she's linked to the meeting. I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe steepled his fingers, eyes closed again. They move, he said softly. The lawyer and the gambler form an axis. The wife remains apart for now. The girl is their target, but perhaps not for the reasons she supposes. He leaned back, sighing like a mountain shifting in its sleep. Very well. Tomorrow, Archie, you will bring them here. One by one, if necessary. I must see them in my office. They will betray themselves where they cannot escape. That was Wolfe's declaration of war. The brownstone, his fortress, would become the ring where the game reached its climax. I sat back, watching him, and knew the storm was closer than Harriet imagined. Because when Wolfe summoned suspects into his office, the endgame was already underway. Word count, Buon 560. Do you want me to move directly into the confrontations inside the brownstone, Wolfe's circle of suspects phase, or should Archie first detail Saul's deeper shadowing of Fisk and Gerald, showing what they're plotting, before Wolfe pulls them all under his roof? When Wolfe said he wanted the players under his roof, I knew it wasn't going to be as easy as dropping a line and waiting for fish to leap into the net. Getting people like Gerald Langdon, Evelyn, and Fisk to stroll willingly into Wolfe's office required a blend of coaxing, bluff, and just the right seasoning of threat. Harriet would be easy. She was already hanging on every word Wolfe spoke through me. The others, though, would want to know why. And worse, they'd want to control the terms. Wolfe hated terms. His office was his temple, and you didn't bargain with the priest about which way to kneel. The next morning, After the orchids and breakfast had been dealt with, Wolfe summoned me with the gravitas of a judge ready to pass sentence. He dictated short, sharp invitations for each of the suspects, polite but firm, dangling the promise of clarity while leaving out what exactly would be clarified. My job was to deliver them in a way that guaranteed cooperation. I started with Harriet. She answered her phone on the first ring, her voice tight as if she'd been holding it in her hand waiting. When I told her Wolfe wanted her at the brownstone that evening, she didn't hesitate. "Yes, of course. I'll be there," she said. That was the easy part. Gerald was next. I found him at the Azure again, looking like he'd slept in his jacket and borrowed someone else's tie. He tried to laugh it off when I told him Wolfe wanted a word, but the laugh came out brittle. "Why would Wolfe want me?" he asked, eyes darting around like he expected creditors to leap from behind the bar. "Because you're one of the people in the will," I said. "And because your cousin Harriet has already hired him. You can either come voluntarily or wait for Inspector Kramer to start knocking on doors. And I guarantee you Kramer knocks louder." That did it, Gerald agreed, though he tried to turn it into a joke. "Fine, fine. Wolfe wants an audience with the gambler. He'll get it." I've never minded a good show. Evelyn required more finesse. I caught her at home again, immaculately dressed and cold as ice. She listened without blinking, then gave me a stare sharp enough to cut glass. "Why should I?" she said. "Harriet has spun this drama to amuse herself. I won't play along." "You don't have to play," I told her. "But Wolfe has a way of making sure that those who refuse end up answering to someone less agreeable. Kramer's itching for a reason to drag the whole clan into his office. If you don't want that sort of publicity, you'll sit in Wolfe's chair instead. And between us, you'll prefer his chair to Kramer's." She held my gaze for a long moment, then gave the smallest shrug, the kind that said she hated being maneuvered but recognized the checkmate. "Very well. I'll come, but only because I'd like to hear what ridiculous conclusions he has drawn." That left Fisk. I saved him for last because I expected the most resistance. When I entered his office again, he didn't rise this time. He sat behind his immaculate desk, hands folded, eyes cool. "Nero Wolfe requests your presence," I said, keeping it short. "Does he?" His voice had the same dry edge. "I see no need to indulge him." "You don't have to indulge him," I said easily, "but it might save you trouble. You met with Gerald last night, privately. Someone saw you." For the first time, the lines around his eyes twitched. "Not much, but enough. And if you don't come to Wolfe, that little meeting will be the first thing Kramer hears about. I don't need to tell you how he reacts to secret meetings between beneficiaries of a contested will." The pause was long, but not eternal. Finally, Fisk inclined his head. "This evening, then." By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already in his chair with the beer at hand. I gave him the rundown and he grunted in satisfaction. "Good. They will arrive at 7. Arrange the seating." That was Wolfe speak for preparing the battlefield. He wanted them placed where he could study each angle, hear every sigh and shuffle. I adjusted the chairs in a half circle, leaving Wolfe's desk as the throne from which he'd dispense judgment. Evening fell like a curtain. Fritz set the office in order, replacing the ashtrays, polishing the glasses, and ensuring nothing was out of place. Wolfe tolerated disorder in the world, but not under his roof. Harriet arrived first, punctual and taut with nerves. She sat rigid in her chair, clutching her handbag as though it held her lifeline. Gerald stumbled in next, overcompensating with jokes that no one laughed at. Evelyn followed, composed and disdainful, nodding to no one. Fisk was last, of course, and he entered as though he were granting Wolfe the favor of his presence. Wolfe greeted them with a nod, nothing more. His eyes roved over them like a slow tide, pausing just long enough to let each one feel the weight. Then he spoke. "You are here," he said, "because Charles Langdon's absurd contrivance has set you against one another. Money dangled above your heads has already led to threats, intrusions, and maneuvers. I do not tolerate such disturbances in my client's life, or in my own." Gerald tried to laugh, but Wolfe's glare silenced him. Evelyn crossed her legs and said nothing. Fisk leaned back, expression unreadable. "Someone," Wolfe continued, "has sought to frighten Miss Langdon, first by theft of a letter, then by placing a knife upon her pillow. These are not random acts. They are deliberate. And they were committed by one of you." The silence that followed could have been sliced with Harriet's knife. I sat by the wall, notebook open, watching their faces. Gerald swallowed. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. Fisk's jaw tightened. Harriet just looked down, clutching her bag tighter. You may protest innocence, Wolfe said, but your actions will betray you. I intend to uncover the author. And when I do, the consequences will be decisive. It was the opening salvo. He didn't accuse yet. He didn't name names. He just set the trap, letting the silence draw them into it. They were in his office now, under his rules, and every twitch of their mouths and hands was another clue added to his ledger. I leaned back, pen ready, knowing the night was only beginning. Wolfe had gathered his circle, and from here on, the walls of the brownstone would hold their secrets until Wolfe crushed them out. Do you want me to carry this straight into Wolfe's first probing questions and verbal traps for the suspects, or expand the tension with their uneasy waiting, glances, small exchanges, and Archie's sharp observations, before Wolfe begins dismantling them? The quiet in Wolfe's office was the kind that stretched nerves taut. I've seen crooks squirm under a spotlight at police headquarters, but this was different. There were no uniforms, no fingerprints being dusted, no evidence bags laid out on the table. Just Wolfe, a mountain of composure in his oversized chair, letting the weight of his silence press down on four people who had every reason to sweat. Gerald was the first to crack. He shifted in his seat, his voice thinly varnished with cheer. Look, this is all very dramatic, but I don't see why Harriet's bad dreams and misplaced kitchenware mean we're dragged into a lineup. Wolfe didn't move his head. You misunderstand, Mr. Langdon. You are here not because I suspect you, but because I know one of you is guilty. The purpose of this gathering is to clarify which. That landed like a hammer on a glass table. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Gerald, sharp and disdainful. Harriet's hands gripped her bag so tightly her knuckles whitened. Fisk's expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped once against his chair arm before going still again. You accuse us, Evelyn said coldly. Without evidence. I accuse no one, Wolfe replied, his voice smooth. I observe. And I draw conclusions. Evidence will follow, as it always does when men and women reveal themselves. I watched the ripple his words caused. Gerald licked his lips. Evelyn's eyes narrowed further. Harriet looked like she wanted to vanish into the leather chair. Fisk leaned forward slightly, as if testing the air for traps. Wolfe shifted one hand toward the wrapped knife on his desk. This was left upon Miss Langdon's pillow. It was not meant as a weapon. It was meant as a message. Whoever left it is not subtle. They wished her to feel the imminence of harm. That is a form of pressure. So which of you grows impatient? Gerald coughed out a laugh. Not me. If I wanted Harriet dead, I'd hardly pick her kitchen drawer as my arsenal. No? Wolfe's eyelids drooped. Yet you met last evening with Mr. Fisk in secret. You drank heavily afterwards. A man does not drink to celebrate when his affairs prosper. He drinks to drown the taste of desperation. That shut Gerald up. His face went blotchy, his mouth opening and closing without words. Evelyn didn't even try to hide her contempt. I told you, she said sharply. You're a fool, Gerald. Meeting Walter in some bar, whispering like conspirators, it makes you look guilty even if you aren't. Fisk's voice was low, even, precise. Mrs. Langdon, you overestimate the importance of our conversation. Gerald required counsel. I obliged. It is what I do. Wolfe turned his gaze on him. Counsel regarding what? How best to wait. How to endure 6 months in patience. Nonsense. You counseled him in strategy. Yet the will is clear. There is no strategy. There is only endurance. Unless, I put in, somebody finds a way to shorten the waiting period. Like removing a rival or two. Harriet flinched as if the words themselves had cut her. Wolfe let the silence sit again, heavy, deliberate. Then he spoke with the weight of finality. One of you has already acted. The theft of the letter, the planting of the knife, these are not accidents. They are steps in a sequence. But the pattern is too clumsy. Whoever planned it sought to frighten Miss Langdon into error. Perhaps to withdraw her claim. Perhaps to run. But not to kill. Not yet. He leaned back, fingers interlaced across his stomach. The question is, why frighten? Why not strike at once? Evelyn's voice was cool, almost amused. Because perhaps none of us actually wish Harriet dead. Fear alone might accomplish what violence cannot. Fear could make her yield or falter. That was as close to an admission as anyone had given. I saw Wolfe's eyes flicker, and I knew he had seized on it precisely, he murmured. Fear. It is the lever. But it has not worked. Miss Langdon came to me. Therefore the plotter will escalate. That is inevitable. Harriet finally found her voice, small but steady. Mr. Wolfe, you're saying someone here will try again? Inevitably, Wolfe repeated. And more boldly, the failure of subtlety leads to recklessness. That is where they will betray themselves. Gerald shifted again, his nerves unraveling. This is insane. We're sitting here like schoolchildren, while you tell ghost stories. Harriet's worked up, that's all. Fisk didn't steal any letters. Evelyn wouldn't dirty her hands. Hand me, he broke off, realizing he had nowhere to go with it. Fisk's eyes turned on him, sharp as needles. You talk too much, Gerald. And you talk too little, Gerald shot back, his voice breaking. Maybe Harriet's right. Maybe you did scare Uncle Charles. Maybe you wanted it all for yourself. Wolfe's hand lifted slightly, cutting through the bickering without raising his voice. Enough, I do not permit squabbling in this office. You will leave now. All of you, Mr. Goodwin will escort you. We will meet again soon, and then truth will be inescapable. The dismissal was abrupt but effective. Evelyn rose immediately, her chin high, sweeping past Gerald as if he were dust on her shoes. Fisk followed with measured steps, his eyes flicking briefly toward Wolfe as if calculating something unseen. Gerald hesitated, muttered a curse under his breath, and slouched out. Harriet lingered, her face pale. Mr. Wolfe, she said softly, you really believe one of them will— Yes, Wolfe said simply. Go home, Miss Langdon. Do nothing, say nothing, and above all, wait. That is what will undo them. When the door closed behind her, the office settled into quiet again. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, fingers tapping once against his chair. I broke the silence. You didn't really expect confessions tonight, did you? Of course not. But their reactions are more valuable than words. Fisk too controlled, Gerald too defensive, Evelyn too candid. And the girl, frightened, yes, but perhaps not entirely forthcoming. I wonder— He didn't finish the thought. Instead, he reached for his beer, sipping slowly. I knew better than to press, but as I sat back, my gut told me something had shifted. Wolfe had cast his net. Now it was only a matter of which fish thrashed first, and how hard. Do you want the next section to dive into the increased pressure phase, where another event shakes things up outside the brownstone, or keep the tension simmering, inside with Archie shadowing suspects under Wolfe's direction until the next crack appears? After the last of them left, and the brownstone was sealed again in its evening stillness, Wolfe sat unmoving, lids lowered, as though he were conserving his bulk for whatever inevitable thunderstorm lay ahead. I didn't disturb him. Experience had taught me that when Wolfe retreated behind his eyelids like that, he was replaying every flicker of a face, every tone of voice, every pause. He might have looked like a fat man digesting dinner, but he was rearranging human motives as though they were pawns on his chessboard. I went upstairs, but sleep came slow. The images ran circles in my head. Harriet pale and trembling, Evelyn with her sharp tongue, Gerald sweating in desperation, and Fisk watching all of it with eyes that missed nothing. Wolfe was right. One of them had crossed the line already, and the next move would be more dangerous. Harriet's pillow knife wasn't the crescendo, it was the overture. The phone rang at midnight. I was awake, so I caught it on the first buzz. Saul Panzer's voice was low, urgent, and that alone told me something had broken loose. Goodwin, Gerald Langdon, just got himself into trouble. Bad. What kind? He staggered out of a club, drunk as a dockhand. A car tried to collect him. He slipped, fell into the gutter. Might have looked like bad luck, except the driver swerved toward him twice before peeling off. I got the plate number. He's alive but rattled. Went home shaking, I swore softly. An accident that wasn't an accident. You think it was meant to scare him or finish him? Closer to finish him. Whoever was driving didn't care about subtlety. Stay on him, I told Saul. I'll loop Wolfe. Wolfe was waiting when I entered the office, robe wrapped around him, eyes bright. He had picked up the phone downstairs before I'd even hung up upstairs. That's Wolfe for you. He hates exertion but has a sixth sense for when to rouse himself. Gerald, he said, not a question. Someone nearly made him roadkill, I confirmed. Saul thinks it was deliberate. Plate numbers in hand. Wolfe's fingers tapped on the desk. So, the gambit escalates. First fear, now attempted harm. Rashness has set in. Question is, I said, Was it staged to make Gerald look like the victim, or was it a genuine attempt to erase him from the ledger? Both are possible, Wolfe conceded. But Fisk remains central. Gerald is unstable, Evelyn is calculating. Fisk, he is the architect. That word architect carried weight. Wolfe didn't use it lightly. At 9 the next morning, I was back in my suit and on the way to police headquarters. If someone had tried to mow down Gerald Langdon in the middle of Manhattan, Kramer's people might have already picked up chatter. I found the inspector in his office, red-faced and irritated as usual, puffing a cigar that looked like it wanted mercy. "What is it now, Goodwin?" Wolfe stirring his fat nose into another mess. "Not his nose, his brain," I corrected. "Gerald Langdon almost got flattened last night. Car swerved at him twice. If Saul Panzer hadn't been there, he'd be a headline," Kramer grunted. "We heard. Gerald's too drunk to give a statement worth the paper. But we've got the plate. Belongs to a rental. Rented yesterday afternoon under a false name. Any leads?" He scowled. "Don't fish. You know I can't hand you files. Tell Wolfe if he's got something concrete he can come to me." "Wolfe doesn't come to anyone," I said, and left before he could bark more. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the update. He digested it in silence, then spoke slowly. "A rental. Anonymity purchased. That requires planning. Gerald is the weakest link. Eliminate him, and his share collapses into the remainder. But if he dies, suspicion spreads. No, this is too hasty, too crude. Someone is desperate." He steepled his fingers. "Bring them all again, tonight." I stared at him. "All of them? You really think they'll come back after the last show?" "They will. Fear draws people tighter than trust. And now Gerald has nearly died, Harriet will insist. That will suffice." So it was. By evening I'd made the calls, and by some mixture of threats, persuasion, and Wolfe's invisible gravity they came. Gerald arrived pale and shaken, the swagger gone, his voice hoarse from too much whiskey. Evelyn followed, looking at him with open contempt. Fisk came last, composed as ever, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before, as if he'd just returned from pushing a pawn into danger. Wolfe began without preamble. "Last night someone attempted murder. Not with guile, not with patience, but with a car. Gerald Langdon was meant to die." The room snapped taut. Harriet gasped softly. Gerald muttered, I told you they were after me." Evelyn's lips curved, sharp as glass. Fisk didn't move at all. "I do not tolerate crude violence," Wolfe continued. "It exposes the hand too easily. But it tells me something invaluable. The plotter is no longer content with shadows. They fear discovery, and so they hasten. That haste is their undoing." Gerald shot to his feet. "It was him." He jabbed a finger at Fisk. "He told me last night we had to act, that Harriet was too cautious, that the will was a trap." "He's the one!" Fisk's eyes narrowed, voice level. "You are drunk again, Gerald." "Sit down." "I'm not drunk," Gerald barked. "You wanted me to help you." "I wouldn't. And now a car tries to run me over?" "Who else could it be?" Wolfe lifted a hand, calm as an executioner. "Enough. I will speak." The room froze. "One of you has made 3 errors," Wolfe said, voice low, resonant. "The theft of the letter, the knife upon the pillow, and the reckless attempt last night. All 3 carry the same hand. And I know which." His eyes opened fully now, sharp, alive. He let the silence stretch, the tension coil tighter. Gerald was panting. Evelyn was still as marble, Harriet trembling, Fisk unreadable, and Wolfe, immovable, was about to spring the trap. Word count 1555. "Do you want the next section to be Wolfe's full reveal, laying out the guilty party's motive and method? Or should I stretch the suspense by having Archie describe one last round of verbal sparring and contradictions before Wolfe drops the hammer? The silence in that office was something you could have bottled and sold to undertakers. Wolfe sat back, immense and serene, his gaze sweeping across the 4 of them as though they were curios displayed for his judgment. Gerald was trembling in his seat. Evelyn's fingers drummed once against her knee and then stilled. Harriet looked as if the floor might open and swallow her. And Fisk, Walter Fisk, sat with his back straight, eyes narrow, mouth compressed into the line of a man daring Wolfe to speak his name. Wolfe did not oblige. Not yet. He let the tension spread until even I felt the skin at the back of my neck tighten. Then he spoke, not raising his voice, but each word carried like a gavel. The letter first. "That theft was not about money, but about control. Charles Langdon wrote to his daughter, warning her, Whoever stole that letter feared his words, feared exposure. The thief had access, subtlety, and a reason to remove the only document that hinted at danger. The lawyer, perhaps. Convenient. But too convenient. Mr. Fisk is disciplined. He would not risk so clumsy an act. He understands evidence. Fisk's face didn't change, but I saw the faintest shift of his shoulders as if he'd allowed a breath to escape. Gerald leaned forward, eyes wide. Forward, eyes. The knife, Wolfe continued. A vulgar gesture, intended not to kill but to terrify. That is not Fisk. He does not dramatize. Nor is it Gerald. His cowardice prefers the bottle to the blade. No, the knife was theatrical, meant to unnerve. That requires calculation of another kind. Someone who understands that fear bends the will. Someone who believes Harriet might crack if she felt hunted. Evelyn's lips twitched. You're looking at me. Yes, Wolfe said simply. You, Harriet gasped. Gerald let out a strangled laugh of relief, then caught himself. Fisk turned his head slowly toward Evelyn, studying her as though reassessing everything he knew. Evelyn did not flinch. Her eyes glittered, her chin high. If you expect me to deny it, Mr. Wolfe, you'll be disappointed. Harriet has always been weak. Frighten her enough and she'd withdraw, sparing us her share. It was logical. Harriet half rose from her chair, white-faced. So you came into my home. Sit down, Wolfe commanded, and she obeyed, trembling. His voice turned harder, but the knife was not enough. The plot escalated. Gerald's near death last night was no accident, Mrs. Langdon. The driver of that rented car was hired. By you, Gerald shouted, half in triumph, half in horror. I knew it! I told you Wolfe cut him off with a look that shut him like a slammed door. Yes, Gerald, you were meant to die, and your death would have served Evelyn's ambition well. With you gone, her position would shift. But Evelyn... He leaned forward now, eyes sharp, words precise. You made a mistake. You rely too heavily on fear. Fear is volatile. Harriet did not break. She sought protection. Gerald did not die. He lives to speak. And Fisk. Our Fisk is too shrewd to share the blame. He leaves you alone, exposed. Evelyn's mask cracked for the first time. Her mouth opened, then closed, her composure rattled. Evelyn, Wolfe said, voice slow, final, you were the hand behind the theft, the knife, the car. Ambition poisoned you. You saw opportunity where your husband faltered, where Fisk remained aloof. But ambition without subtlety is ruinous. You betrayed yourself the moment you turned from shadow to violence. The silence that followed was thicker than before. Harriet stared at Evelyn in horror. Gerald stared at Wolfe as if salvation had dropped from the ceiling, and Fisk's eyes gleamed with something between satisfaction and contempt. Evelyn straightened, every inch of her braced against collapse. And what will you do, Mr. Wolfe? Accuse me to the police on what? Harriet's hysteria? Gerald's drunken babble? Your deductions? On your desperation, Wolfe said calmly. Mr. Goodwin retrieved the knife. It carries no prints, but the cloth I wrapped it in does. Yours, Mrs. Langdon? You handled it when you sought to arrange its discovery. Your attempt at cleanliness was careless. Inspector Kramer will find your trace upon the fibers. That hit her like a bullet. Her face drained of color. Her lips parted, then pressed tight again. Gerald let out a long breath, a half sob. Harriet closed her eyes, shuddering. Fisk, ever composed, allowed himself the faintest curl of a smile. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low, brittle. I did what was necessary. Charles's money was wasted on her, wasted on Gerald. I would have used it well. But no one sees the sense in that. You sit there, fat and smug, dismantling lives with words. What have you ever risked, Mr. Wolfe? Wolfe's eyes closed, and when he spoke it was like granite sliding into place. Risk is for the foolish. I deal in truth. And the truth, Mrs. Langdon, is that you mistook ruthlessness for intelligence. You will learn the difference in prison. Evelyn rose suddenly as though to storm out, but I was already on my feet. She froze, realized she had nowhere to go, and sat again, her fury smoldering in silence. Wolfe rang for Fritz, and when he appeared, Wolfe instructed him to call Inspector Kramer. Harriet buried her face in her hands. Gerald slumped back, exhausted. Fisk smoothed his sleeve, calm as ever. As Fritz went to make the call, Wolfe leaned back once more, fingers steepled, his work concluded. Justice, he murmured, is rarely elegant. But it is inevitable. I sat down, scribbling notes I didn't need, and watched Evelyn Langdon's composure crack piece by piece. The brownstone had swallowed her whole, as it had so many before, and Wolfe, immovable as ever, had bent the truth into the shape of judgment. Word count 1562. Would you like me to carry the final section into the aftermath? Kramer's arrival, Wolfe's closing reflection, Archie's final quip, or stretch Evelyn's final resistance into a sharper confrontation before the inevitable surrender? Kramer arrived in his usual fashion. No knock, no courtesy. Just the door flung wide and his bulk filling the frame like a battering ram. He had 2 plainclothesmen with him, but it was his cigar that announced him before his voice did. "All right, Wolfe," he barked. "You drag me down here in the middle of dinner hours. This better be good." "It is," Wolfe replied without opening his eyes. Evelyn Langdon attempted to frighten her cousin Harriet into abandoning her claim. When fear failed, she escalated to violence. She orchestrated the theft of the letter, the knife upon the pillow, and last night's attempt upon Gerald's life. You will find her prints upon the fabric in which Mr. Goodwin retrieved the knife. Evelyn shot to her feet. "This is absurd." "You can't—" "Sit down," Kramer thundered. His men stepped forward, and Evelyn's protest wilted into silence. The look she threw Wolfe was pure fire, but he didn't return it. His eyes stayed closed, hands folded across his stomach. Kramer turned to me. "You got the cloth?" I handed it over, still folded neat. "Straight from the scene to here. Untouched except by me and Wolfe. You'll have your prints," Kramer grunted, already signaling his men to take Evelyn. She stiffened as they guided her out, but she went without more words. Gerald sagged as though his strings had been cut, and Harriet, pale and shaken, whispered a trembling thank you that Wolfe waved away like smoke. Fisk alone remained steady, his face unreadable as he watched his rival swept off to custody. When the door closed again and quiet returned, Wolfe exhaled long and slow, like a man finished with a heavy meal. "So ends the nuisance. So ends the nuisance." Harriet rose unsteadily. "Mr. Wolfe, I don't know how to thank you." "If you hadn't—" "Phoy," Wolfe interrupted. "You hired me. I performed the work. That is the arrangement. Mr. Goodwin will show you out." She hesitated, clearly wanting something warmer, but Wolfe was already reaching for his beer. She gave me a wan smile and I walked her to the door. Gerald stumbled after, muttering promises of repayment to the universe, though he looked like he'd be drunk again before midnight. Fisk shook my hand gravely before departing, his eyes flicking once toward the office, as though filing Wolfe away for later reflection. When they were gone, I returned to find Wolfe restored to his chair, glass lifted. Fritz appeared with the evening's roast, and the brownstone began its slow return to peace. I dropped into my own chair. So that's it. Evelyn gets a prison cot instead of an inheritance. Harriet gets her nerves back in order. Gerald lives another day to drink away his share. And Fisk walks off clean. Clean? Wolfe snorted. He will never be clean. But he was not guilty of this. He will bide his time, as will Gerald. Money corrodes the weak, Archie. In time, both may falter. But that is no longer our concern. I leaned back, watching him sip his beer. And what's your final take, boss? What's the moral of tonight's little performance? He set the glass down, eyes half closed. That inheritance is a curse more fatal than any disease. It tempts the ambitious, feeds the desperate, and humiliates the foolish. Charles Langdon thought to bind his heirs together. Instead, he revealed what they were. Such contrivances are folly. Justice, when it comes, is not born of money. It is born of truth. Fritz laid the roast on the table. Wolfe lifted his fork, signaling the close of business. I couldn't help grinning as I reached for my own plate. Truth may be what you trade in, Wolfe, but I'll stick with roast duck and a paycheck. He gave me a glance sharp enough to slice. Your levity, Archie, is a continual affront to logic, but fortunately it does not impede it. And with that the brownstone settled again into its rhythm, the case closed, the silence restored, and Wolfe, as ever, unmovable at the center of it all.